Daniel Carter, a successful millionaire, thought he had left his past behind until a luxurious wedding invitation appeared on his desk. Claire Kensington, the woman he once loved, was about to marry someone else. He knew attending could stir up painful memories, but he also understood he couldn't go alone. Should he show up at her wedding as a failure or leave everyone speechless? In a moment of impulsiveness, he made a bold decision. He invited a complete stranger to accompany him, but not a rich, prestigious woman. Instead, he invited Arlette, a homeless woman he'd randomly met on the street. Why did Daniel choose her? Was it just a way to challenge his past, or did he truly see something special in Arlette? Arlette initially doubted Daniel's intentions. She couldn't believe a millionaire like him would want to take her to such a lavish event. But after a few moments of hesitation, she agreed, not knowing that this decision would change her life forever. What happens when Arlette steps into the world of the rich? Can she face the judgmental gazes and whispered gossip? And most importantly, will she truly remain just a +1 or become the center of attention at the party? You won't want to miss the dramatic twists that follow. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to follow this unexpected story. The soft, golden light from the towering skyscrapers reflected off the windows in Daniel Carter's luxurious apartment, casting shadows on the cold, gray walls. He sat silently on his expensive leather chair, gripping the intricately designed wedding invitation on the desk. The gold-embossed lettering stood out against the creamy white paper, each line of text printed so perfectly it left him breathless. Claire Kensington and Theodore Marshall cordially invite. The words cut into his mind like a knife, reminding him that the past he once cherished was truly over. A year ago, Claire had left him. She said he was too consumed by work, too lost in ambitions and numbers to remember that love needed nurturing too. Daniel vividly remembered that moment when she stood before him, her eyes filled with hurt and disappointment. "I can't live like this anymore, Daniel. I need someone who's truly there for me." Those words echoed in his mind like a sad melody, repeating over and over. In the time since, he thought she was just upset, that if he gave her time to calm down, everything would go back to normal. But no, Claire had gone for good, and now she was about to marry another man, a man who had likely given her what he couldn't. Daniel flipped the invitation in his hand, his gaze stopping on the line that detailed the location. The most extravagant hotel in the city, where only the weddings of the elite were held. He could picture everything clearly. Claire in her magnificent, pristine wedding dress, crystal chandeliers reflecting sparkling light onto the dance floor, the laughter of guests in their elegant gowns and tuxedos, wine glasses glimmering under the soft glow of the lights. And somewhere in that scene, Claire would be smiling the smile he once adored, but this time it would be for someone else. The thought made a heavy weight press down on Daniel's chest. Attending this wedding wasn't easy, but refusing was even harder. If he didn't show up, it would be like admitting he still hadn't gotten over her, that he was still tangled in the past. And for someone like Daniel Carter, that was unacceptable. He wasn't weak. He wasn't the type of man to let his past drown him. If he went, he had to show up in a way no one could expect. He needed to make everyone turn their heads, to make Claire realize he was no longer the man she had walked away from. But what about going alone? That thought flashed through his mind before being quickly dismissed. Showing up alone at such a lavish event would be like making himself a pity case in the eyes of everyone around him. He needed someone with him, someone who could make them all gasp, someone they couldn't predict. But who would that be? The women he dated after Claire? No, they were all the same. Beautiful, sophisticated, but none of them truly stood out. Daniel wanted something different, a choice that would make the entire room buzz. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning toward the window where the city still gleamed with light. A bold decision slowly began to form in his mind, an idea that was somewhat crazy but irresistibly alluring. A complete stranger, someone no one at the party could predict, someone who didn't belong in that world but could make that world take notice. And in that moment, Daniel Carter knew he had a plan. That evening, the city draped itself in a vibrant curtain of neon lights, with flashing signs and a sea of people bustling to and fro. The streets were packed with traffic, the blaring of horns, laughter, and hurried conversations blended together into a chaotic urban symphony. Yet amidst all the noise and clamor, Daniel Carter found himself feeling oddly disconnected. He walked aimlessly, unsure of his destination. Claire's wedding lingered in his mind like an inescapable ghost. Though he had decided to attend, he still couldn't shake the bitter feeling gnawing at his heart. It wasn't because he still loved Claire, but because it served as a painful reminder of something he had lost, something that had once been the most important thing in his life. His steps led him to a narrow street far from the glittering center of the city. This was a place where the city lights no longer blazed, where dark alleys hid behind aging buildings. Gone were the luxury shops and expensive restaurants, replaced by late-night street food stalls, small cafes with a few patrons lost in thought in the shadows, and people who had long since grown accustomed to being forgotten by the world. The air here felt colder, not just from the wind blowing through the narrow passages, but from the quiet that enveloped everything. Daniel had passed by places like this countless times, but he had never truly stopped to look closely. As he was about to turn onto another street, he suddenly stopped. A solitary figure sat on the sidewalk beneath the faint glow of a street light. The woman was curled up in an old coat, her arms wrapped around her knees as if trying to keep some warmth on the cold night. Her curly hair hung messily over her thin face, but even through the dirt, there were features that hinted at quiet beauty. But what drew Daniel's attention wasn't her appearance, it was her eyes. Eyes that were calm, resilient, without any trace of pleading or despair. Unlike the homeless people he had seen before, she didn't stretch out her hand for spare change, didn't bow her head in submission to the stares of passers-by. She simply sat there quietly, observing the world as if she were an outsider with nothing left to hope for, nothing left to lose. Daniel frowned, not understanding why he was so captivated by the sight. A man like him, a wealthy businessman, would never usually stop to care about such things. He was used to lavish dinners, meetings with the elite, numbers on computer screens more important than anything else. But right now, that didn't seem to matter. He looked at the woman before him, wondering what kind of life she had lived to end up like this. Was she once someone who had a good life, had dreams, had believed in something before everything fell apart? A cold gust of wind blew through, causing her thin coat to flutter slightly. Daniel suddenly found himself stepping closer, though there was no clear reason in his mind to do so. As he closed the distance, he realized she had noticed his presence. She didn't look away, didn't seem startled or surprised. She simply looked up, her gaze steady, as if she had long been accustomed to being watched by others. "Hello." Daniel spoke, his voice calm but slightly hesitant. The woman squinted at him, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was, a curious passerby, a pitying soul, or just someone so bored with his own life that he sought some amusement in a street corner where he clearly didn't belong. But she didn't seem upset. She merely responded in a nonchalant manner, "Hello." Her voice was low and soft, not at all panicked or uneasy. Daniel felt a strange sense of intrigue. "What's your name?" he asked, realizing he genuinely wanted to know more about her. She paused for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Then finally, she spoke. "Arlette." The name echoed in the quiet night, carrying with it a strange feeling Daniel couldn't quite explain. It wasn't a name he'd ever heard in the circles of high society, not the kind of name he'd hear at lavish parties or business events. It was something strong, yet shrouded in mystery. Daniel stood there staring at her for a moment longer, and in that instant, a wild thought flashed through his mind. A thought so crazy that even he couldn't believe he was about to speak it aloud. The cold wind swept through the quiet street, carrying with it a hint of the night's dampness. Arlette tugged her old coat tighter around her, but her eyes never left the man in front of her. His proposal had caught her completely off guard. A wedding? A lavish event she had never dared to imagine? And this man, a millionaire, clearly someone from a world entirely different, was standing in front of her seriously asking her to accompany him. "Would you like to go to a wedding with me?" Daniel repeated, his tone now calmer, though there was still a hint of disbelief in his voice, as if even he couldn't quite believe what he was saying. He wasn't sure why he had made the offer. Maybe because the thought of attending the wedding alone made him uncomfortable? Maybe because he wanted to create a surprise no one could predict? Or maybe, at this moment, amidst the chaos of his life, this woman sitting in front of him was the only thing that felt real. Arlette stared at him, her dark eyes flashing with suspicion. "Are you joking?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm serious. I'll take care of the clothes, the food, and make sure you have a memorable experience." He didn't know why he wanted her to believe him so badly. Perhaps part of him understood that she would refuse if she thought it was just some game, a distraction for a wealthy man bored with his life. Arlette fell silent, but Daniel could see her thinking quickly. She wasn't the type to be swayed by promises of fancy dresses or a lavish meal. She had lived too long in the harshness of the world to know that nothing was free, especially not from the wealthy. But there was something in Daniel's eyes, a strange sincerity, a search for something he himself didn't fully understand. It wasn't pity, it wasn't arrogance. It was simply an offer, no more, no less. "Why me?" Arlette asked, her voice not filled with doubt, but with genuine curiosity. Daniel paused for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because you're not like the others. Maybe because you'll make people notice. Or maybe simply because I want to." Arlette let out a quiet laugh, rare, soft, but tinged with irony. "Your world is strange, Daniel Carter." Daniel shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "So, would you like to step into it just once?" Arlette still looked at him, as if weighing two paths before her. One was the familiar safety, continuing her invisible life in the crowd, unnoticed, uncared for. The other was completely unpredictable. It could be a strange experience, perhaps a game of fate, or it could be the turning point she never expected. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "All right." Daniel looked at her, feeling a strange sense of relief he couldn't explain. Little did he know, this decision would change both of their lives forever. As the morning sunlight bathed the polished stone streets of the downtown area, Daniel drove Arlette to a renowned fashion boutique. The glass buildings reflected the city's grandeur, luxury cars gliding by at a slow pace, and elegantly dressed people entering expensive stores where only those of high status were allowed to shop. Sitting in the passenger seat, Arlette quietly watched the scenery pass by, feeling a sense of unfamiliarity in her chest. When the car stopped in front of a high-end fashion store with a sparkling glass facade, Daniel got out first and opened the door for her. Arlette hesitated for a moment before stepping out. She had never set foot in a place like this, where the dresses in the display windows were so extravagant she didn't dare to think of touching them. But not wanting to show hesitation in front of Daniel, she took a deep breath and followed him inside. The moment they passed through the heavy glass doors, a brief silence swept through the luxurious space of the store. All eyes immediately turned toward them, but not because of Daniel. People were accustomed to the sight of wealthy businessmen like him. It was Arlette who became the center of attention. The sales staff, used to catering to elite customers, paused for a moment to observe the woman accompanying Daniel. Their eyes were full of judgment, from the old, worn-out coat to the scuffed shoes, to her messy hair and the sun-kissed skin from months of living on the streets. Arlette was nothing like the usual clientele. She stood out like an ink stain on a perfect painting, a stark contrast in a space designed for those with money and power. A slender female sales associate in a tight, professional dress approached with a polite but clearly cold smile. She looked at Daniel first, then her eyes scanned Arlette with suspicion, as if wondering if this was some kind of joke. "Good morning. How can I assist you?" Her voice was soft, but the tone betrayed her uncertainty in having to welcome someone who didn't fit the atmosphere of the store. Daniel paid no attention to the attitude. He looked directly at the saleswoman, his voice firm without hesitation. "She needs a dress for an important event." The saleswoman paused for a moment. Though she was used to extravagant requests from wealthy clients, this was the first time she encountered such a situation. She glanced at Arlette again, seemingly debating whether to subtly refuse. But when her eyes met Daniel's serious gaze, one that made it clear he was not joking, she reluctantly nodded. "Please follow me," she said, her tone now slightly more rigid. She led them to the VIP section, where dresses were displayed in glass cabinets, each one more expensive than the average person's entire fortune. A few other staff members glanced at Arlette, whispering amongst themselves, but no one dared speak aloud. Arlette could feel the judgment in their stares. She didn't need anyone to voice it. She knew exactly what they were thinking. She didn't belong here. But rather than bow her head in shame, she lifted her chin and walked with quiet composure. If they wanted to judge her, let them. She had grown accustomed to it long ago. Daniel walked beside her, sensing the tension in the air. He knew what Arlette was facing, but instead of saying something to reassure her, he simply walked next to her an unspoken affirmation that she had nothing to worry about. They were about to enter a new challenge, not just finding a dress, but proving that Arlette, no matter where she came from, deserved the best that life had to offer. And this was only the beginning. Arlette stepped into the fitting room, her fingers lightly brushing against the soft fabrics of the dresses hanging on the racks. An overwhelming sense of unfamiliarity washed over her. When had she ever found herself standing in a space like this, a room filled with extravagant gowns? Each seam and stitch was perfect. Every bead, lace, and silk was meticulously crafted to the point that she couldn't even fathom their value. These dresses weren't just beautiful. They represented a world she had never belonged to. Her fingers glided over a deep blue dress with an elegant design, but before she could touch it again, a sales associate stepped forward, her expression clearly displeased. "Are you sure you want to try these dresses on?" Her voice was gentle, but the skepticism was undeniable. Arlette met her gaze, saying nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. She knew exactly what others were thinking about her. Slowly, she picked up another dress, this time a burgundy evening gown with a soft fabric that hugged the body. She stepped into the fitting room, the door closing softly behind her, separating her from the scrutinizing eyes outside. Her breath was a little tight as she looked at herself in the mirror. She couldn't remember the last time she wore something as beautiful as this. Perhaps it had been years back, when she had a stable job, a life where she didn't have to worry about where her next meal would come from. But now, all she saw was a thin woman in a glamorous dress, a stark contrast that made her question what she was doing here. Taking a deep breath, Arlette slowly stepped out, and then she noticed the first thing. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The sales associates, the other customers, all turned to look at her, but it wasn't admiration in their eyes. It was judgment, suspicion, and disdain. Whispers spread across the room. Who is she? Is she a homeless girl? What's Daniel Carter thinking? Did he really bring her here to try on these dresses? Arlette felt a cold chill run down her spine. The whispers weren't gentle. They were filled with clear contempt. Without needing to turn around, she could feel their eyes glued to her, as if she was something that shouldn't be here. She clenched her teeth, her mind swirling. She knew she didn't belong in this world. From the moment she stepped into the store, she had felt it. The sense of being judged, looked down upon, considered an outsider in this extravagant space. It was never comfortable. But when her gaze unintentionally found Daniel's, she saw him standing there, completely calm. He wasn't bothered by the gossip. He didn't care about the disapproving looks around them. When their eyes met, he simply smiled, a smile that wasn't filled with pity or forced kindness, but one of reassurance, as if he were silently telling her that she had nothing to fear. And in that moment, Arlette realized something. She could choose to lower her head, let the gossip weigh her down, or she could stand tall, just as she always had when facing challenges greater than this. She took a deep breath, relaxed her shoulders, then gently smoothed the dress. She said nothing, but her gaze became more resolute. If this was a challenge, she wouldn't let anyone make her feel unworthy. Arlette stood in the fitting room, her hands gently caressing the soft fabric of the last dress she had decided to try on. The previous dresses had either been too extravagant or hadn't made her feel truly comfortable. But this dress, a deep green gown with a minimalist yet refined design, brought a completely different sensation. It didn't try to make her look opulent or glamorous in a forced way. Instead, it highlighted the most natural aspects of her appearance. She gazed at her reflection in the mirror, a strange feeling rising within her. The woman she saw before her was no longer a homeless soul with tangled hair and worn-out clothes. Her smooth brown skin stood out more than ever beneath the deep fabric, and her body's contours were soft, yet still held onto their strength. The dress didn't just make her look beautiful, it gave her something even more important, the confidence she thought she had lost long ago. Taking a deep breath, Arlette turned gently, allowing the hem of the dress to flutter with each step as she made her way out of the fitting room. The door opened, and this time, there were no mocking laughs or whispered remarks. The sales associates, the other customers in the store, all looked at her with completely different eyes. There was no longer any contempt or suspicion, but surprise and even a hint of admiration. No one could believe that the woman who had walked in here disheveled was now exuding such regal composure. Daniel stood nearby, immediately noticing the change. His gaze was fixed on her, not in the way of a man admiring a beautiful woman, but in the way of someone seeing something deeper, a powerful transformation, a rebirth that even she didn't recognize yet. He walked toward her, unable to hide a satisfied smile. "You look incredible." Arlette looked at him, her eyes brighter than ever, not because of the compliment, not because she expected praise, but because for the first time in many years, she truly believed it. She had once thought that beauty belonged to those from another world, but now she understood it had never left her. It was just that she had forgotten how to see it within herself. She smiled, a real smile, no longer tinged with irony or hesitation. This was no longer a game or a challenge. This was the moment she stepped away from her past and onto a path she never imagined she could walk. The luxurious car slowly rolled down the road lined with lights, heading toward the grandest event venue in the city. From the outside, the opulence of the event surrounded everything. Gleaming marble columns, crystal chandeliers casting reflections on the marble floors, and a row of expensive cars parked neatly in front of the entrance. Daniel opened the car door for Arlette. As she stepped out, a gentle night breeze brushed past, making the hem of her deep green gown sway, creating an image that was both alluring and quietly proud. Without a word, Daniel extended his hand. Arlette looked at him for a moment, then placed her hand on his arm. That moment was not just a polite gesture, but a silent affirmation. They weren't here to seek approval from anyone. They entered with the confidence of those who were fully in control of themselves. The large doors opened, and as they stepped inside, time seemed to stand still for a brief moment. The vast event hall inside was bathed in soft light from the high-hanging crystal chandeliers. The banquet table stretched out, adorned with sparkling crystal glasses and shining silverware. Red wine swirled in tall glasses, and classical music played gently from the live orchestra in the distance. The wealthiest and most powerful people in the city gathered here, their extravagant evening gowns blending with expensive tuxedos to create a perfect portrait of luxury. But what drew all eyes wasn't the opulence. It was the entrance of Daniel Carter and the woman accompanying him. Whispers grew quieter. Polite smiles faltered for a moment before turning into wide-eyed astonishment. Some guests leaned in to whisper to each other, while others simply observed curiously. For them, Daniel Carter was a well-known name, a successful businessman, a man with a solid career, and once a central figure at high society events. But tonight, it wasn't his presence that caught attention, it was the woman by his side. Arlette felt it. She could hear the murmurs rising from the corners of the tables, could sense the probing looks passing over her. But what was different this time was that she didn't feel afraid or awkward standing in a space she was never meant to belong to. She no longer felt small or out of place. From across the room, Claire Kensington stood next to her new husband, wearing a pristine white wedding dress that sparkled under the lights. She was conversing with a group of guests, but her eyes were fixed firmly on Daniel and the woman beside him. A forced smile appeared on her lips as she walked toward them. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm, but her gaze betraying an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I didn't expect you to come." Daniel simply nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course." Claire paused for a moment, her eyes moving over to Arlette, discreetly assessing her from head to toe. But there was no hiding her curiosity. She could tell that this woman wasn't one of the familiar faces from high society, but there was something undeniable about her. Arlette had a very unique presence. Arlette didn't look away from Claire's gaze, nor did she lower herself. She stood tall, more confident than ever. She was no longer the girl who had been looked at with pity. She was no longer someone standing on the sidelines of this glamorous world. She knew very well that this was only the beginning of a long night, but at least she had walked through this door with her head held high. And whether Claire noticed or not, the balance in this game was beginning to shift. As Daniel and Arlette entered the ballroom, a ripple of whispers spread throughout the room like an invisible cold breeze. Powerful guests, wealthy businessmen, women in extravagant evening gowns, all turned to look, their eyes fixed on the couple that had just arrived. But what they whispered about wasn't Daniel Carter. It was the woman by his side. Who is she? She looks so out of place. Did Daniel Carter really bring someone like her here? She doesn't belong here. There's no way she does. The murmurs weren't loud, but they were enough for Arlette to hear. She didn't need to catch every word to know what they were thinking. The way they eyed her, from her hair to the gown that was perfect yet somehow didn't quite fit the elite style, to her every movement, it all reflected doubt, judgment, and even disdain. But Arlette didn't let it shake her. She had faced such looks before, but this time she wasn't the woman sitting on the sidewalk, forgotten by the world. She had entered this world, and she wouldn't let anyone make her feel unworthy. She lifted her head high, her lips curling into a faint smile, not one of arrogance, but of quiet assertion. Her hand rested lightly on Daniel's arm, a silent declaration that she wasn't some outsider trailing behind him weakly. She stood beside him, not as someone needing protection, but as someone strong enough to face anyone who dared question her. Daniel sensed it, and he didn't need to say anything. He simply tightened his grip on her hand slightly, a silent gesture of support. He knew that tonight wasn't just about Claire, wasn't just about his past. It was also about Arlette, about the way she had entered this world with the poise of someone who wasn't ready to bow her head to anyone. The party had only just begun, and those prying eyes had no idea what was about to unfold before them. The atmosphere in the ballroom grew tense as Claire approached, her smile still in place, but her eyes full of scrutiny. She walked gracefully, her pristine white wedding gown hugging her perfect figure, creating an image that was flawless in every sense. But there was something that no one could ignore. Behind that smile was an unmistakable restlessness. Daniel looked at Claire, his gaze no longer soft like it used to be, but also free of tension. He knew exactly what she wanted when she walked over, but this time he wasn't rattled. Claire stopped in front of them, her eyes briefly scanning Arlette with clear judgment before turning to Daniel with a polite smile. "You haven't introduced your friend yet." Claire spoke, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone that was hard to place. Daniel turned to Arlette, as if to make it clear that she wasn't just someone accompanying him. He gave a warm smile. "This is Arlette." Arlette felt Claire's gaze move over her, not hiding her scrutiny, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, maintaining a calm and steady gaze, as if this were just a normal conversation. "How interesting," Claire said, her tone tinged with sarcasm. "I've never heard that name before. How do you two know each other?" Arlette kept her smile, but this time there was a sharpness in her eyes. "We met by chance," she replied, her voice steady but without any trace of submission. "Sometimes the most important relationships start in unexpected ways." Claire squinted slightly, her smile not fading but losing its natural warmth. "Oh, really?" She glanced at Daniel, as if searching for some sort of sign from him. "You always have interesting choices, Daniel." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, his gaze calm but sharp. "I think what suits me doesn't necessarily need to make sense to others." Claire hesitated for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. "I guess so," she said, then turned to Arlette, her eyes challenging. "How do you feel about being at a party like this? I imagine it's quite new." This time, Arlette's smile grew clearer, but it wasn't shy or defensive. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "Not really," she responded, her voice still light, but with an underlying meaning. "I think parties like this are just stages. Everyone has their role to play." The words made Claire raise an eyebrow. She hadn't expected Arlette to be so unyielding. The woman before her didn't tremble, didn't show any sign of confusion or anxiety. In fact, she was clever enough to respond with subtlety. Claire smiled faintly, but her eyes weren't fully amused anymore. "Maybe you're right," she replied, her voice no longer as sharp as before, but still tinged with something less than acceptance. "It's just that some people don't really belong on this stage." Arlette looked straight at her, her gaze calm, but carrying a hint of challenge. "Is that so? I think sometimes it's the new characters who make the play more interesting." Daniel raised an eyebrow, somewhat amused by how Arlette handled the situation. Claire, though not saying it out loud, was clearly displeased by that response. A moment of silence passed between the three, as if a silent battle had taken place right there in the middle of the opulent hall. The guests around them quietly observed, sensing the delicate tension between the two women, one the bride on her big day, the other the mysterious woman standing beside her ex. But Arlette didn't back down. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all to Claire. She was simply herself. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "Anyway, it's a pleasure to meet you, Arlette," she said, her tone no longer sharp, but still lacking full sincerity. Arlette smiled, gentle but unyielding. Thank you. Your wedding is beautiful. Claire gave a slight nod, then turned away, heading back to her guests. But no one, least of all her, could deny that this confrontation had not been easy. Daniel looked at Arlette, his admiration for her clear in his gaze. You handled that well, he said, his voice teasing but full of respect. Arlette glanced at him, her smile still in place. I just spoke the truth. And with that statement, she knew she had done more than she had imagined. Not only had she stood firm in this world, she had made them look at her with different eyes. The crystal chandeliers above cast a sparkling glow, reflecting off the wine glasses filled with rich red liquid and the dazzling gowns worn by the guests. Laughter and conversation echoed throughout the room, but amidst all the grandeur, Arlette could sense a different kind of atmosphere, a silent, sharp observation, like invisible knives cutting through the air. She could feel the eyes surrounding her from all directions. Some were merely curious, but most carried suspicion and scrutiny. The women in their extravagant gowns whispered behind elegant hand fans, their full lips curving into half-smiles full of hidden meaning. Meanwhile, the men in finely tailored tuxedos watched her with looks that were both probing and baffled, as if trying to figure out where she came from and how she had managed to step into this place, a place they believed she didn't belong. The whispers began to rise, first soft murmurs, but gradually becoming more audible and clear. Who is she? Is she homeless? This is a joke, right? What the hell is Daniel Carter doing? Arlette swallowed quietly, an indescribable feeling creeping into her chest. She had become accustomed to the judgmental stares, had felt the distance from the world when she quietly sat on the sidewalk. But this time it was different. This wasn't the pity or indifference she had faced before. This was blatant evaluation, a denial that she deserved to be here. For a moment, she could feel the old insecurities rising within her, a small voice in her head whispering that she was just an outsider in this world, that these people had every reason to look at her this way. A part of her wanted to turn away, to find a corner to hide from this scrutiny. But then another part of her, the stronger part, the one that had helped her survive through the hardest years, pushed her to stand tall, to hold her head high. If she stepped back now, she would let them win. She would become exactly what they thought of her, a person who didn't belong in this world. But Arlette wouldn't allow that. She adjusted her posture, gently placing her hand on Daniel's arm as a silent affirmation that she belonged here, that she was not passive, not someone for others to judge. Daniel, who was no stranger to such lavish events, noticed the subtle change in her. He leaned slightly toward her, whispering in her ear, his voice warm and caring. Are you all right? Arlette glanced at him. In his eyes, there was no pity, no doubt, only sincere concern. She felt a warmth spread inside her, a comfort amid the coldness and alienation of this place. She nodded lightly, her eyes shining with determination. I'm fine. And with those words, she reminded herself that no one had the right to define her worth except for her. Across the room, amidst the lively laughter and the polite handshakes, Claire maintained the perfect appearance of a happy bride. But deep inside, there was something unsettling stirring within her. She could feel the gazes of the guests around her, heard the whispered admiration for the extravagant wedding, but all of that seemed to fade into the background in the presence of one image she couldn't tear her eyes away from: Daniel and the woman beside him. Claire couldn't deny it. Daniel seemed happy. Not the kind of happiness that was forced or fake, but a comfort so strange it almost made her uncomfortable. There was something in the way he looked at her, the way he smiled at this woman, the way he looked at her as if no one else existed in that room. It all made Claire feel uneasy. She had thought that if Daniel showed up, he would come alone. She had imagined that when he saw her in her perfect wedding dress, standing beside her new husband, he would feel a twinge of regret. Maybe he would try to appear strong. Maybe he would force a smile. But deep in his eyes, Claire had expected to see a hint of something, a little bit of pain, a touch of regret, some sign that he hadn't fully let go of her. But instead, he arrived with a woman she had never seen before, someone completely different from the women Daniel had been with before. And worse yet, he didn't seem to be trying to prove anything. There was no forced gesture, no comparison, just a chilling calmness that made Claire uneasy. She wondered, had he really forgotten her so quickly? Or was this just a ploy to make her jealous? Claire didn't like this feeling. She didn't like that another woman had stepped into Daniel's life so effortlessly. She knew Daniel well. He wasn't the type of man to open his heart to just anyone, especially not after a painful breakup. So who was this woman? Claire pursed her lips, an uncomfortable feeling rising inside her that she couldn't quite name. She needed to know the truth, and if Daniel was really trying to play a psychological game with her, she wouldn't sit idly by and let him do it. Claire moved through the room with the poise of a queen. Her immaculate white wedding dress hugged her perfect figure, and with each step, she exuded the grace that came from years of living in high society. But behind that gentle smile, every step she took was calculated. She had spent the entire evening observing Daniel and the mysterious woman with him. Now, she had decided she wouldn't wait any longer. If Daniel wanted to play this game, she was ready to join in. Claire stopped right in front of Daniel, her eyes briefly glinting with a subtle, knowing amusement. She tilted her head slightly, keeping the smile of the perfect bride in place. "Daniel," she said, her voice sweet but unmistakably sharp. "What a surprise to see you here." Daniel smiled politely, showing no sign of hesitation. "Why? I'm on the guest list, after all." Claire raised an eyebrow, a flash of challenge in her eyes. "Yes, but I thought you wouldn't come. And certainly not with such a special guest." She glanced at Arlette, her eyes assessing her like a foreign object she hadn't encountered before. But if Claire was expecting a sign of discomfort from Arlette, she was mistaken. Arlette stood tall, calm, and completely composed. She was no longer the woman sitting on the sidewalk. She had long since learned to face such stares, those looks that tried to evaluate her, to find her weaknesses and undermine her. But now she was confident in who she was. Daniel kept his smile, but there was an edge to it now. "Arlette is my companion for the evening." Claire chuckled lightly, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "How interesting." She turned to Arlette, her voice still sweet, but now tinged with scrutiny. "So, Arlette, where are you from?" Arlette didn't falter, her voice calm as though this was just a normal conversation. "I live in this city." Claire nodded, but her eyes remained skeptical. "Really? It's surprising I've never met you before." Arlette met her gaze directly, unfazed. Her smile held deeper meaning, but her voice was gentle enough to make Claire pause and think. Maybe because we come from different worlds. The atmosphere suddenly became more tense. Claire paused for a moment, her eyes flashing with irritation. She hadn't expected such a sharp reply, let alone the woman in front of her responding so smoothly and confidently. But Claire quickly regained her composure. She smiled, though this time there was something colder in her eyes. "Maybe so." Daniel silently watched the entire exchange, a slight smile playing on his lips. He knew Claire wasn't one to back down easily, but he also recognized something clear. Arlette wasn't the type to be cornered. And Claire knew that now, but she didn't like it one bit. After Claire left, the tension between Daniel and Arlette seemed to ease, but it was only on the surface. Arlette could still feel the curious eyes around her, the whispers lingering in the air, but it didn't bother her as much. Daniel looked at her, his eyes holding a mix of amusement and surprise. "You didn't have to respond to her like that," he said, his tone teasing but not really serious. Arlette shrugged, her eyes calm yet sharp. "I just spoke the truth." Daniel paused for a moment, then chuckled softly. "I like that." Arlette smiled faintly. She hadn't intended to argue with Claire, but she wasn't about to let anyone belittle her either. If Claire thought she could intimidate her with veiled comments, she was sorely mistaken. But across the room, Claire was not feeling the same relief as Daniel and Arlette. She was quietly irritated. Her plan had been very clear. She wanted Daniel to come here alone, looking lost and regretful upon seeing her in the arms of another man. She had imagined that his eyes would linger on her with nostalgia, with unspoken longing, that he would feel regret for losing her and then leave the party with an emptiness he couldn't fill. But the reality was completely different. Daniel wasn't lost. He wasn't bothered. And that was more infuriating to Claire than anything else. She looked over at him, seeing him smile gently at Arlette, an undeniably sincere smile. Daniel had never been the type of man to openly express his emotions, but Claire knew him well enough to recognize that he wasn't faking it. He was genuinely enjoying the evening, and that was something she couldn't accept. Who was Arlette? Where had she come from? What had she done to be standing next to Daniel so naturally? Unlike the other women who had come before her, Arlette wasn't trying to fit into this world, but somehow she made Daniel look completely at ease. Claire pressed her lips together, maintaining her perfect exterior as she continued talking to the other guests. But inside, a storm was beginning to brew. She needed to get to the bottom of things, and this time, she wouldn't let Arlette have the upper hand so easily. Claire was not the type to accept defeat easily, and she certainly wouldn't allow someone like Arlette to walk into Daniel's life without any control over the situation. She had always prided herself on understanding Daniel better than anyone, knowing his thoughts, how he would react, and more importantly, knowing what would make him reveal his true feelings. If Daniel was truly happy, she needed to know why. And more importantly, she needed to determine whether it was genuine happiness or just a cleverly orchestrated act to make her jealous. Claire took a sip of her wine, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Daniel and Arlette were still deep in conversation, completely oblivious to her. The fact that they were ignoring her only made Claire feel more uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being dismissed. She slowly turned to a man standing nearby, Michael Bennett, a young entrepreneur and one of her longtime friends. Michael was the type who wasn't afraid of psychological games, and, more importantly, he enjoyed a little drama. Claire leaned in and whispered something into Michael's ear. He listened, then raised an eyebrow, his smile turning sly. He didn't ask for clarification, didn't need to know Claire's motives. He simply liked the drama, and Claire knew exactly how to work that to her advantage. Michael nodded, set his wine glass down, and quickly walked away. Claire watched him leave, a small smile curling at the corners of her lips. If Daniel was indeed hiding something, she would find out. And if Arlette didn't belong in this world, Claire would make sure everyone saw that for themselves. The sound of clinking glasses echoed through the opulent ballroom, but at the bar, a group of guests had gathered, whispering with subtle hints of intrigue. There were furtive glances, smirks, and soft laughter as their eyes shifted toward Arlette. The air around her slowly grew more tense, as if an invisible storm was quietly gathering. And then a man approached, Michael Bennett. He looked impeccable as always, with a perfectly tailored tuxedo, carefully groomed hair, and a mischievous glint in his eyes. But there was something in his smile that didn't seem entirely harmless. Daniel, Michael spoke up, deliberately raising his voice to draw attention. I'm really curious. He paused, his eyes moving over to Arlette with blatant appraisal. Who is this girl? I've never seen her at any of these events before. Daniel's expression remained unchanged, but his muscles subtly tensed. He crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. So what? Michael shrugged innocently, playing the part. Oh, nothing. I just thought we all deserved to know a bit about this mysterious woman. He turned toward Arlette, his smile now carrying a challenge. Go on, Arlette. How did you meet Daniel? Arlette felt every pair of eyes on her. She could hear the whispers ripple around her, feel the anticipation growing on some faces. They wanted a story worth talking about, a bit of drama to spice up their evening. She tightened her grip subtly, but kept her voice steady. We met by chance. Michael raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Ah, a chance encounter, he smirked. That sounds interesting. But would you like to elaborate? Perhaps where have you been living before? A few in the crowd chuckled softly. Arlette sensed the mocking undertone behind his question. This was no longer a casual conversation. This was an attack. She knew what they were looking for, a mistake, a weakness, a reason to label her as someone who didn't belong here. Daniel immediately recognized it. There was no doubt now. Someone had deliberately brought up Arlette's past to undermine her. And it didn't take long for him to figure out who was behind it. His eyes swept across the room, and it wasn't hard to spot Claire standing in the distance, her wine glass in hand, an expression of calm on her face, but her eyes gleaming with a hint of satisfaction. She wanted to test Arlette. She wanted to see if this woman was truly strong enough to stand her ground in their world. But Claire had underestimated both Arlette and Daniel. The soft clinking of glasses faded as Arlette stood firm, the weight of the whispers and mocking glances around her growing thicker, like an invisible wave trying to push her out. But instead of retreating, instead of letting the fear consume her, she lifted her head, her eyes shining with unwavering determination. She turned to face Michael Bennett directly, the man who had tried to humiliate her in front of a room full of powerful guests. The silence slowly filled the room as everyone realized she wasn't afraid. You want to know the truth? Arlette spoke, her voice calm but laced with an edge that was impossible to ignore. Michael raised an eyebrow, as if expecting a flustered reply, confusion, or perhaps even pleading from her. But he didn't get that. Arlette continued, her words ringing out clearly in the lavish room. I had a normal life. I had a job, a home, a clear future. But then a series of unfortunate events happened, and I lost everything. I had to sleep on the streets, struggle to survive every day. I know what it feels like to be ignored, to be looked down upon, to be seen as invisible. The room fell into a heavy, tense silence. The mockery that had filled the air moments ago suddenly disappeared. Some guests had heard stories like this, but it was rare that they had to face it so directly. Arlette scanned the room, her eyes gleaming with strength and pride. I'm not ashamed of that. I survived the worst days of my life, and here I am, standing right here. But it seems like that makes you uncomfortable? Michael faltered, the smile on his lips freezing for a moment. He hadn't expected Arlette to react this strongly. He had been expecting a weak woman, someone incapable of responding to his veiled words. But instead, he was facing a woman who was unshaken, someone unafraid to speak the truth, and it left him speechless. Daniel, who had been silently observing, stepped forward, his expression darkening with resolve. When he spoke, his voice carried an unmistakable protective tone. Everyone has a past, but what matters is not where they've been, but who they are becoming. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in the charged air. Then he turned his gaze, locking onto a distant point where Claire stood. She had witnessed everything from the start, and now, as Daniel looked at her, the entire room understood that he knew she was the one pulling the strings behind this. Daniel didn't look away from Claire, his voice low but as sharp as a knife. And if anyone thinks they have the right to judge others because of where they come from, then perhaps they are the ones who are truly pitiful. A wave of silence enveloped the entire ballroom. No one dared to speak. No one dared to laugh. The people who had once mocked Arlette now looked at her with a different gaze. Some were ashamed, while others began to reconsider how they had judged a person. In the distance, Claire gripped her wine glass tightly. She could feel the shift of eyes now turning toward her. She hated this feeling, the feeling of losing control. She had thought she could easily corner Arlette, but she had underestimated this woman. Arlette had not only stood firm in the face of the mockery, but had turned the tables, making Claire the one who came out looking defeated. But this was not the end. Claire had never been one to back down easily, and if Arlette thought this was over, she was sorely mistaken. Claire stood motionless in the lavish room where, just moments ago, she had been the center of attention. But now that had shifted. The eyes of the guests, the whispers of intrigue, were no longer focused on Arlette. They were all on her now, the one who had tried to expose Arlette's past and failed miserably. She couldn't believe it. Her plan had been supposed to be flawless. She had expected to see Daniel hesitate, to see him falter when Arlette's past was laid bare. She had thought he would realize his mistake, that he would return to reality and recognize that she was the one who deserved to be by his side. But instead, the opposite had happened. Daniel had sided with Arlette. Not only had he defended her against the humiliation, but he had also made it clear to everyone that her past did not define who she was. And when he looked at Arlette, Claire realized the most painful truth. Those eyes were no longer for her. A bitter feeling welled up inside her. She had once been the only woman to receive that look from Daniel, the one he would do anything to keep. She had always believed that no matter how far they drifted apart, Daniel would never truly forget her. But now, as she looked at him, she knew she had lost him completely. She couldn't let it end like this. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him, trying to regain her composure. Daniel, she spoke, her voice maintaining its elegance, though it couldn't hide the impatience beneath. Do you really think she's the right one for you? She doesn't belong in this world. Daniel didn't blink, his gaze sharp but devoid of anger. There was only one thing in his eyes: determination. Claire, he said, his voice calm but firm. This isn't about which world she belongs to. It's about who I want beside me. Claire froze. She knew that whatever she said now couldn't change the truth. Daniel had made his choice, and what was more terrifying was that he no longer thought of her. She clenched her fist tightly, gripping the wine glass in her hand. She had lost, but a part of her refused to accept it. But no matter how hard she tried, she knew tonight she had lost the most important thing in her life. After everything that had happened, Arlette felt she needed some space to breathe. Quietly, she stepped into the garden behind the ballroom, where the moonlight bathed everything in a soft, ethereal glow, contrasting with the suffocating atmosphere inside. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, but it couldn't wash away the turmoil inside her. Tonight she had faced what she had always avoided: judgment, scrutiny, and even insults. She had grown accustomed to being looked at with pity, but this time it was different. This wasn't just about being judged by strangers. It was about confronting her own self-doubt. Did she truly deserve to be here? The sound of footsteps approached behind her. She didn't need to turn around and know it was Daniel. He walked up beside her, silent for a moment. Then his warm voice broke the stillness. "Are you okay?" Arlette sighed, her gaze still fixed on the distant lights. "I don't know, Daniel. Tonight has been difficult." Daniel nodded. "I know." He paused briefly, as if considering his next words. "But you did great." Arlette turned to look at him, her eyes revealing a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. "Daniel, do you think I'm just part of your plan to prove something? Part of a way to forget Claire?" His words caught him off guard. He had never expected Arlette to feel that way. But when he looked at her, he knew this wasn't an empty question. It was her real fear, something she had tried to hide but couldn't. He took a deep breath, then responded, his voice firmer than ever. "No." He looked her straight in the eye. "At first, maybe I didn't think much about it. But then I realized you weren't just a companion for the evening. You're the person I want beside me." Arlette felt her heart race. Part of her wanted to believe his words, but another part of her hesitated. "Are you sure?" she asked softly, as if wanting to hear him say it again. Daniel didn't hesitate. He gently took her hand, his touch warm and filled with certainty. "I'm sure." They stood there in silence in the garden, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. No one spoke for a while, but everything that needed to be said seemed to have already been understood. Arlette slowly smiled, a true smile. She didn't know what the future would hold or what the path ahead would bring, but in this moment, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. "Well then," she said softly, "we'll see where this goes." Daniel tightened his grip on her hand, a smile also appearing on his lips. "I'm looking forward to it." Together, they walked out of the garden, leaving behind what no longer belonged to them: the past, the pain, the judgment. Tonight, a new chapter had begun, and this time, they wouldn't let anyone define their fate. After his conversation with Arlette in the garden, Daniel returned to the ballroom. The lights still sparkled, the laughter and chatter still echoed, but to him, everything felt meaningless. He realized that this wedding no longer mattered to him. It was just the final chapter of an old part of his life, a chapter he was ready to close. As he walked past guests lost in their extravagant conversations, he approached Claire, who stood alone near the bar. She was still radiant, but the smile on her face was no longer confident as it once was. Claire saw him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There were no more reproaches, no more mind games. Just two people who had once loved each other now standing before one another as strangers who had been through too much. Daniel took a deep breath, then spoke softly, his voice calm. "Congratulations." Claire blinked, a hint of sadness passing through her eyes, but she said nothing more, merely nodding slightly. "Thank you." Daniel, without saying anything further, turned and walked away. He didn't look back, and for the first time in many years, he felt relief. After that night, Arlette's life changed completely. She was no longer the woman sitting silently on the sidewalk, avoiding the world's gaze. Daniel helped her find a job, a simple one, but enough for her to start over. He also helped her find a place to stay, a safe shelter instead of cold, lonely nights on the streets. But more than anything, Arlette found herself. She had once thought that the world had no place for her, that she would always be an outsider, never able to walk through those grand doors. But she was wrong. She didn't need to change to fit anyone. She just needed to face her past with strength and keep moving forward. She was no longer someone who only knew how to run away. She had learned how to stand up. Daniel and Arlette didn't rush to define their relationship. They didn't jump into each other's arms like a fairy tale with immediate vows and promises. Instead, they took their time to understand each other. They built something real, not based on pity or the need for someone to fill a void, but based on respect and empathy. Then, on a sunny afternoon, as they walked together through the bustling streets of the city, Arlette turned to Daniel, a gentle smile spreading across her face. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. Daniel looked at her, a warm smile lighting up his eyes. No. He shook his head gently, his voice sincere. Thank you, Arlette, for teaching me that sometimes the most wonderful things come from the places we least expect. They walked side by side, without any promises, because they both knew their story had just begun. This story isn't just about a wedding, a relationship, or a reunion between people who were once close. It's a story about transformation, the lessons life brings, and most importantly, about finding the value of yourself even when the world seems to turn its back on you. Arlette entered this world not to be rescued, but to prove that the past does not define who we are. She was no longer the woman sitting quietly on the sidewalk, accepting the pitying gazes of others. She was a strong, proud person, deserving of love just like anyone else. Daniel learned that happiness doesn't lie in what he has lost, but in what he can find. He realized that sometimes what we think is the end is actually a new beginning. And the person who can change us is not always someone we expect, but could be a complete stranger, someone we meet by chance, but who leaves a lasting impact on our lives forever. As for Claire, she learned a valuable lesson. Wealth, status, and power don't always bring true happiness. She had everything others wished for, but in the end, she lost the most important thing: true love that she once took for granted. Life is full of surprises, and sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who change us the most. Do you believe that every encounter in life happens for a reason? What do you think about Daniel's decision? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Journey for more heartfelt stories to come.